it is really, really great to have so many of you here this afternoon as we think about what it means to disciple people for fruitful retirement. Now, I'm the kind of person who doesn't mind there being an elephant in the room, but sometimes it's a good idea to at least acknowledge the elephant is there, and then hopefully more people become comfortable with that elephant, and they don't leave the room. Now, the elephant that I'm talking about is today we're talking about retirement, but this webinar is being led by a young whippersnapper. And in addition to that young whippersnapper, there's also myself. And so it's I just think it's important that we just talk about, well, why is it that there are these two relatively young guys leading this seminar? What could we possibly know about this, and why would you want to stay? So I'll just start with myself, and then I'll let Ken speak for his young self. I've been a researcher with LICC now for nearly 10 years. And throughout the time that I've been doing my research with LICC, I have lots of conversations with church leaders and with small group leaders and with frontline Christians. And over that time, one of the trends that I've noticed is that when I'm talking to these people, as I say, whether they're church leaders or individual Christians, there just seems to be lots of people, they use some of our resources. So they might have used Life on the Frontline or Fruitfulness on the Frontline or some of the Gateway 7 series or something like that. And what I often hear is that, those who are students or those who are working or those who are raising kids tend to find it a bit easier to recognize that they have a place in the world where they can make a difference for God, that they can recognize their front line, and they recognize, yeah, I can see how this is a place that is significant, where I'm connecting with people and where God can use me. Whereas for many people, when they move into retirement, what I was hearing is that people in retirement were saying, well, we find it a little bit harder to identify some of the places that God might be at work in me outside of church. But yeah, so older people and those who are discipling older people are saying they were just finding it trickier to identify the front lines and to feel confident in those places. And so I really felt strongly that this is something that we really need to do something about. At LICC, we talk a lot about the importance of whole life discipleship, about making a difference where you are. But if there's a big chunk of the church who's saying, well, we're actually not finding it that easy to recognize where God is at work through us and how that can happen, then I thought perhaps as an organization, that's something that we should do some research into and do something about. And so I spent a really long time just fully nerding up on retirement. So I spent a long time having lots of conversations with church leaders, with other people who are involved in ministries directly related to discipling and working with older people. I talked lots to people in retirement themselves. I read lots of books. Some of them were good, some of them not so great. I read lots of articles, just spent as long as I could learning as much as I could about retirement, and then thinking about, well, what would it mean to disciple people well for that season of life. And it's also something that I've had direct experience of myself. So at the moment, I work pretty much full time for LICC as a writer and a researcher, and also developing resources. But for quite a big chunk of my working life, I've worked in churches as an associate pastor and as a discipleship pastor. And a lot of that has been not just working with younger adults, but working with people across the age spectrum, including a lot of people who were approaching retirement or were well into retirement. And so have had lots of opportunities to have those kinds of conversations and to experiment and to see, well, what kind of things work. And as well, what I guess from a personal perspective, I've really benefited from the ministry of lots of older people as well, from their example, from their generosity, from their prayers and their wisdom. And in particular, I'm not sure, I'm just kind of scrolling through the screen here. I have a grandmother who is alive and who is 105, and looking at the screens, for those of you who have your cameras on, pretty sure that all of you are well under that bar of 105. But I was a bit of a tearaway kid, and I remember that she would often pray for me. She was the first person who took me to church. And just her example, the testimony of her lifestyle, the way that she cared for people in our family and for her neighbors. There was just something about her character. There's something about Christ in her that I saw even as a young kid who wasn't a Christian at the time. And so that's where I'm coming from, and that's why I'm really excited to be sharing this afternoon with you today, and just yeah, wanting us to think through what it might mean to disciple people for this really exciting season of life. And now I'll pass on to my colleague Ken, who will speak for himself.
Thanks very much, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, welcome everybody. Let me have my welcome. I'm Church Relationships Director for LICC, and it's already been worth me coming to this webinar because it's a very long time since I've been described as a young whippersnapper by anybody. So I'm grateful for that, Joe. But yes, I recognise I'm not of retirement age. And so I also want to just say I'm delighted to be here, and I have a couple of reasons why this is a vital subject from my point of view, heading up our church relationships, and prior to that being a church pastor, church minister for 24, 25 years in a local church. My experience trying to convey this idea of being a disciple wherever you find yourself in the whole of your life, a whole life disciple, has sometimes been that sometimes people of retirement age will say, oh, that's wonderful. If only I'd heard that earlier. If only I'd heard that when I was younger. And then it takes another step to encourage and show that, of course, it absolutely applies through all stages of life, including retirement age. But there's another aspect, I guess, which is that, and some of you are church leaders on the screen of different forms of church leader, you will know this to be true, that we pastorally support people at all sorts of stages of life, going through all sorts of life experiences. And we haven't, as individuals, individual church leaders, been through all of those experiences ourselves. So we will, at LICC, try to reach millennials and young adults. We have a big emphasis on that. I'm not a millennial or a young adult, but I will still try and reach them. As a church pastor, I won't ignore the subject of singleness, even though I'm married. I won't ignore the subject of not having a child for those who really want a child, even though I'm blessed to be a parent. What I would do is I would carefully talk to, and most importantly, listen to those who have had those experiences, and then try to offer some way forward using the expertise which they've shared. But there's also a biblical principle conveyed in 2 Corinthians where Paul says, God helps us in all our troubles so that we're able to help others who have all kinds of troubles using the same help we ourselves have received from the Lord. Which means, now he was talking about trouble there in that particular circumstance, but the basic principle is the help that we've received from God can apply wider than our own individual experience that we have been through. So we come at this subject, both of us with a heart for it, with Joe, who you'll hear most from, having done the research and the hard yards to bring us all that we have today, but with a confidence that we have listened enough to bring something worthwhile that you can then take to your churches, whether you watching are in this age group or not. Back to you, Joe.
So yeah, I just want to run through what we are hoping you will take home from today. So if you don't like this next slide and what I say in the next 2 minutes, and we see you quietly slip through the back door, then that is absolutely fine if you realize that this is not what you were after. But hopefully we've advertised this correctly and this is what you're after. But just so you know, this is the kind of ground we're going to be covering today, and this is where we're hoping you will end up. Perhaps most importantly, we want to reflect on what the Bible says that will be useful as we think about this season of life. And I can see there's some comment going on in the chat about should we even be using the word retirement? It's the word that is most commonly used, and so that is the reason why we are using that word, although like many of you, I have some issues with it, and hopefully by the end of it you'll know something of where I'm coming from on the subject. Of course, the Bible doesn't use the word retirement, but we will be trying to think about what does the Bible actually say that will apply to this season of life, and that can help us as those who might be in that season ourselves, and certainly as people who are looking to equip and encourage others as they go into and through that particular season of being in retirement. I want us as well to think about where we might be going wrong, how some of the things that our culture says and the way that our culture and society thinks about age and retirement might perhaps not be quite in line with what God says and what God thinks, and maybe even sometimes how some of that thinking has leaked into the church and how that can affect the way that we do ministry within our churches. So we'll be covering that. I want us as well to really paint a positive picture of what fruitfulness in retirement can look like, and to help us to do that, for those of you who have connected with us in any ways before, you'll know that we love to share real life stories to make sure that this isn't just something theoretical, but it's something that we earth in the real life experiences of Christians based here in the UK. I want to share with you as well, Ken and I want to share with you some practical ideas so that you can go away and have some ideas of some things that you can actually do, whether you are a church leader or whether you lead a ministry with older people. Perhaps you're a small group leader, maybe even just in the conversations that you have with your retired friends. There'll be some really practical things that you can do to help to equip and encourage people for retirement. And then finally, perhaps almost as excitingly as some of the other stuff as well, we will be unveiling a brand new free resource for retirees that you'll be able to download and use or encourage others in your church or your group to work through. So that is the direction of travel that we're in. Now, at this point, I'm going to make a request that some of you are going to applaud and some of you are going to sneer at me. But what I'm going to request is that if we perhaps could not use the chat function during this seminar, because I know for some people, they love to keep the chat going throughout, and it's a way that keeps them engaged and stimulated. For many others, and for, if you speak to even, a first-year neuroscientist about this, they'll generally say that if you're trying to focus on a piece of content or on what somebody is trying to say, if you do that while you are distracted by lots of other text or by a little box flashing up in the corner, and because there isn't actually the option on Zoom for people who want to opt out to have it stop flashing up, every time a comment is made, it can be quite distracting for those who don't want to be seeing that. So we're not going to disable the chat function. So if there's something that really needs to be said, or if you have a legitimate question, then feel free to pop that into the chat. But my request to you would be if we can try to kind of do chat light for today, just so that we don't have that distraction for those who do find it particularly annoying or distracting. And at the moment, I'm trying to work out how I can't see any applauses. I'm not sure if that's scorn on people's faces or if it's just that time of the afternoon. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Robert. And I can't see everybody on the call, but if there are any other applauses, I receive your applause and I soak that in. So thank you very much. Ken, I'm going to hand back to you. And before you lead us into the next section, I wonder if perhaps you could pray for us in our time this afternoon.
Absolutely. Yes, let's do that. Lord, whatever name we give this age group of your people, of our people, we know that the stakes are high here to get this right, to help a whole bunch of people, as we're going to call it in this seminar, of retirement age, retired people, to live fully as you would want them to, and to point in the right direction for that purpose. So guide us to conversations which in turn help us to translate and transform this to things that will be truly transformative in our churches and among our people. Amen. So it's funny then in our society that we might even need to remember the significant things that can happen through older people. In the ancient world and in the biblical world, they found it hard to believe that God could work through the young. And of course, the same is true in many cultures in the world today. And if the majority of us are logging on from a UK context, then we need to recognize that there are other places in the world that still elevate older people and give them pride of place in a way that perhaps our cultures don't. I'm mixed race, and my Asian relatives would certainly still be in that category. Thank you, that's a helpful start. I'll hand back to Joe.
I just want to take some time now to help us to set the scene before we go on to explore how God might be wanting to grow older people and to work through them. I thought it might be helpful just to look at a couple of statistics and just to get a feel for the lie of the land. One of the things that I just want to raise is that it's actually really hard to get good statistics about church numbers in the UK. It's not too bad if you want to get statistics for some specific denominations, particularly in the Church of England. But on the whole, it's really hard to get good statistics about church attendance and about Christianity in general in the United Kingdom. But there is a guy called Peter Brierley who every so often publishes, he does his best attempt to put church statistics together so that we can get a feel for these things. And quite a humbling moment that I was trying to get hold of a copy of his book, which I think it was at the end of the print run. And so I phoned the number on the website, and it was his wife who answered. And I said, oh, I'd really like to get hold of a copy of this statistics book. And I heard her calling out to Peter, there's a young lady on the phone who wants a copy of your book. So that was a humbling moment for me that for some reason I've just shared with you now. But yes, some statistics. So in 2015, the average age in the UK was 40, and the age of the average churchgoer was 48. And that's from Peter Brierley's church statistics. And if you are part of one of the more historically established denominations, so for example, if you're part of the Church of England, or if you're in the Methodists or the URC, or in the Baptist or in the Catholic Church, then the average within your denomination is going to be higher still. The reason why the average age is brought down to 48 is partly because of churches made up from people who have come to the UK from other countries, particularly certain African countries, and from Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. And also the number is brought down by what are often referred to as the new churches. So churches like the New Frontiers and Vineyard churches and other independent charismatic churches, they tend to bring that number down. In 2015, 33% of church attendees in England were 65 or over. And Peter Brierley predicts that by 2030, it will be more like 45% of church attendees will be 65 or over. Brierley predicts as well that the average age for all listed denominations will have risen by about 10 years by 2030. So, and what's interesting as well is that his statistics came out pre-pandemic. And so obviously the pandemic has affected church attendance in all kinds of ways. But certainly what I've seen in my local church is that we seem to have lost more families through that time than we have older people. So potentially the average age could end up being even higher than what was predicted pre-pandemic. The UK as a whole, as you probably know, has an aging population. That's true across most of the Western world. And the church is aging even faster than the culture that surrounds it. So that's not to say that there isn't some great work being done across the UK with younger people. But the general picture is that we are living in an aging society, and that the church is aging faster than the society that it's in. So there is this challenge for the church to connect with and to grow the younger generations. And I know this is something particularly close to Ken's heart. So Ken, I'm just going to invite you back at this moment, just if you just wanted to say a word about the challenge of reaching the younger generations.
Absolutely, and there's no contradiction, of course, in talking about the challenge of reaching younger generations and serving and wanting whole life discipleship to apply to older generations. In fact, one of the beauties of church is it's one of the very few, at its best, one of the very few cross-generational places that one can be. And so at its best, we can see a possibility, and we see it live in action so beautifully when it happens, of different generations working together and older generations having a heart for younger generations and helping motivate and equip and encourage them in their discipleship. And if you talk to younger adults, one of the things they love very often about church, those who do still go to church or are finding their way to church, is the older generations that are in the mix there. So we can hold these two things in tension, recognizing that we have to face the fact that we are aging and declining faster than the UK population. And so there are challenges for the church about what we do about that. And at the same time, look to serve and equip older people to be whole life disciples, because part of that will be in turn good for younger generations.
Great, thanks, Ken. I just think that's really helpful, the way that you've expressed that. And I know for me, one of the things that I think has been quite hurtful sometimes in the way that church leaders can communicate this challenge that we face in terms of the demographics of the church, is that in saying that they want to reach more young people, sometimes it can almost come across that they want less older people. And I think that's a real shame, that is sometimes the message that is heard, and maybe even sometimes that is the message that is being said. And I certainly don't think that is what God wants us to be saying in his churches. So yes, we do want to connect with more younger people, but we also want to be connecting with more older people as well. We want to be doing, it's very much a both and. We're not at all saying that we want less older people in the church, because God does not see older people as disappointing statistics. For God, at every stage in our lives, we're precious to him. God longs to be with us. He longs to grow us. He longs to work through us. And I love what is said of all of us in Psalm 92, verses 12 to 15, where the psalmist writes, "The righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon. Planted in the house of the Lord, they will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green, proclaiming, the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no wickedness in him." So I really hope, as we've shared that you're understanding where we are coming from today, and just that you, for yourself and for those that you minister to, whatever season of life you are in, God absolutely loves you and those around you, and good things are happening in your life and will happen in your life. So be encouraged by what the Bible says there. Another thing that I just want to acknowledge as we set the scene for today is to acknowledge that as we approach this topic of retirement, that the word retirement itself covers a significant phase of life, and that phase of life can look very different between different individuals based on a whole range of variables. So we shouldn't just think of retirement as being this kind of one two-dimensional static thing. It's very variable for different people within that season. So let me just tell you about some people that I know, just to set up how different life can be for people in their retirement years. So Simon and Nicola are in their late 60s. They're relatively healthy in mind and body, and they're happily married. They're both computer and smartphone literate. They drive, they walk, they cycle, and so that means they can go wherever they want to go, when they want to go there. They've got a good private pension behind them. They play tennis a couple of times a week, and they have good friends and a good network of friends. And as well as all of that, they are actively involved in their local church, in some of the ministries that run in their church throughout the week. They help to lead some of those. And then we compare and contrast with a lady called Bet. Bet is in her late 80s, and Bet has a wicked sense of humor, and she absolutely loves God. But Beth suffers from chronic pain. She has problems in her feet. She's unable to walk. She's unable to drive. She's been widowed for a number of years, and she relies on carers coming into her home to help her with some of the just practical day-to-day things that a human needs. But despite relying on friends and family for a lift, she actually gets to Sunday morning services more often than Simon and Nicola. Now, the reason I share them is just to show that everyone is different. Everybody has their own set of circumstances, and those circumstances will change throughout the course of their retirement years. And so in 5 or 10 years' time, life for Simon and Nicola might look very different to how it looks today. The current average age of retirement in the UK is around 65. By the time I get there, it's predicted to go up to about 113. But the current age is around 65, and the average life expectancy is 81. So if you do the maths, for those of you who are good with your numbers, that means that the average retirement period is around 16 years. Though, of course, for many, it's much longer. For many, it might be 30 or 40 years. However, what we have found in our research is that very few Christians are preparing for retirement from a discipleship perspective. They may have planned from a financial perspective, and many of the people that I spoke to have been put through retirement courses by their companies. But these, I would say, were the best case examples. And when we have these conversations with these retirees or soon to be retirees, and we ask them if they had any conversation with their church leaders about retirement, none of them had, apart from being asked if they wanted to take on additional responsibilities within the organization and the running of the church. Now, this is interesting, and this is something that Ken alluded to when he was introducing himself earlier. And that is, I think that the church, and as Christians on the whole, over the last decade or two, we have got better at thinking through other seasons of life from a discipleship perspective. And so today we have well-established marriage courses, we have parenting courses, there's quite a lot of stuff for uni students. And that is excellent. That is really good to see that that very context-specific discipleship material being made available and being used. That is brilliant. But more people will retire than will get married, or will have kids, or will go to university. And yet, on the whole, most of us are not preparing for retirement from a discipleship perspective. And in the conversations that we have with church leaders, and often these are church leaders who really understand the importance of whole life discipleship and contextual discipleship and missional discipleship, whatever words you might use. But when we ask them how things are going in their church, they often say, I feel like we're making great progress with people who work, with people who are students, with people who are parents, and in the kind of the working, those kind of working age adults, or with their children and their youth. But they often say, we're finding it hard to make progress with the majority of with the older people in our congregations. Now, that certainly isn't true in all churches, and there'll be some of you who are church leaders on this call who say, no, actually, that's the opposite for us. And that is the beautiful thing about life. It is rich and it is different. But I would say across the board, there is a general trend towards churches finding it harder to help older people to live effectively as disciples in that particular season of life. It's also a season where the sacred secular divide can really flourish. And I'm just going to invite Ken back just to talk a little bit about how the sacred secular divide, what that is, and how he sees that flourishing in people's retirement years. So Ken.
Within our LICC, if you've come across our material before or not, particularly if you have, you'll know that we have often talked about the sacred secular divide that exists in often unspoken ways in churches, where some things are seen as sacred, they're seen as spiritual. Music is spiritual in that perspective if it's hymn lyrics or modern Christian lyrics about God and about Jesus. But if it's contemporary music, is it seen as secular? And we would always be trying to say, no, if it's given to God, if it's a Christian doing it, then it is all spiritual. So art isn't just spiritual if it's like a stained glass window, like the one I'm looking at in front of me, because I'm in our offices in St. Peter's, an old church building here. It's art too if it's a Christian doing all sorts of art. It's still spiritual in that sense. It's still sacred in that sense. So that sacred secular divide is something we're always trying to combat. And there is a version of the sacred secular divide that can sometimes surface when people get to retirement age. I've seen it many times in my own church and in other churches too, where people who have been doing paid work, and I know not everybody does, and are getting towards the end of that, will voice something along the lines of, and now I can give my time fully to God and to some things that I really want to do in the life of the church. Well, there's a balance there, because in their paid employment as whole life disciples, hopefully they were giving themselves fully to God as bus drivers, as people working in offices, as carpenters, as plumbers, as nurses and doctors and firefighters and any number of other professions that you could think of. And so it's a shame if we just think, oh, now I can give my time to something that matters to God, because it all matters to God. Now, the balance is, that, and I know this as a church leader, that we're so often blessed by those very gifted and still able people who are early retired, and they may be in a position to give more voluntary time to the church, but we shouldn't confuse that with where they spend most of their time, and still that might and should often be outside of the church, where they're whole life disciples, and that is spiritual too.
At the end of that last section, I introduced this question: why might there be such a lack of vision for discipling people in retirement? Now, I think that the answer to this could potentially be very, very long and very complex, but I'm going to try and boil it down to just 3 factors. Factor number 1, for why there is this lack of vision for discipling people in retirement, is our society's view of age. And I think we've touched on this a little bit already. But generally speaking, in modern Western culture, young is seen as better than old. And we see this in TV, in music, in fashion, just in how people talk and how people think, even the way that the things that we praise and the things that we use as insults, or the things that we might be insulted by. Generally, our culture's view is that to be young and youthful is better than to be old and not youthful. And so often, and sadly, older people are often written off as being past it. And perhaps sometimes that's something that older people might even internalize and think is true, which is really sad. But that's certainly something that has happened in our culture. And as is often the case, our churches aren't immune to what is going on around us, and often we just imbibe a lot of what is going on in culture. We breathe in that cultural air, those cultural fumes, I guess you could say, and we can be polluted by them, and that can then shape how we think about older people within the body of Christ. So I think that's one reason why sometimes we don't have a great vision for retirement and for equipping retirees. The second factor is that many older people have grown up under what we refer to as the pastoral care contract in churches, rather than a contract of pastoral equipping. So in other words, church leaders of any church members rather of any age, but particularly for those who have been in church for a long time, will have this view that I go to church, I be faithful in my attendance, I volunteer, I give, I support the minister or the ministers in their activities, and in return I get taught and I get cared for. But there isn't always that expectation that people will be equipped for the places where they are during the week. And so there just often isn't that expectation that leaders will equip people for their day-to-day lives with Jesus. That's just not part of the deal that is in existence in many churches. And that would be particularly true for those who've been in church for a long time. Again, that's not everywhere. I'm talking generally. And then a third factor that I think is going on, and perhaps this one is the most significant, and that is we primarily view retirement through the lens of vacation and not vocation. So when we hear of somebody in our church who's retiring, if we're honest, many of us probably think, lucky them. They can step off the treadmill and enjoy life. They can now enter holiday mode. And as a church leader, when somebody comes up to you and says that they're about to go on holiday, you don't immediately say, oh gosh, we must pray for you. We've got to prepare you for this. We must think about how you're going to grow in this time and how you're going to work with God for his good kingdom purposes. That isn't what we do when somebody tells us that they are about to go on holiday. And so if we review retirement as a holiday, as a vacation, then no wonder there is a lack of discipling people for this period of their lives. And there's no wonder we're just not seeing it as a key discipleship moment that we need to take seriously and invest some serious time and thought and resource into. So I just want to drill down into that third point a little bit more, that idea of retirement being a time of vocation and not vacation. The word vocation comes from the Latin root vox, meaning voice, and vocare, which is to call. And vocation is about calling. As Christians, regardless of our age or our context, we all share the same ultimate or the same primary calling. Now, what I'm about to share isn't an exhaustive list, but hopefully this just gives a bit of a flavor for what our calling is as the people of God, whoever we are, wherever we are, and whatever numbers we might have on our birth certificate. All of us are called to bear God's image and to steward the creation. And we particularly see that in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, although of course it's not exclusive to the beginning of the Bible. That is what we see throughout Scripture. And then, of course, Jesus said that something that we should probably think is quite important is loving God and loving our neighbor. That is a call that applies to all of us, whoever we are. We are called to belong to Jesus and to respond in faithful obedience to him. That's what Paul says right at the start of his incredible letter to the Christians in Rome. All of us are called to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. That is what we can read in 1 Peter 2:21. But of course, we also hear those in the words of Jesus, where he said, whoever would come after me must take up their cross and deny themselves and follow me. And we are also called to be conformed to the likeness of Jesus. As disciples, we're not just called to follow Jesus, but we are called to become like him so that his life is in us and that we are shaped by him living within us, that our characters change, that we bear the fruit of his Spirit. And of course, all of us are invited to participate in God's mission in the world, his healing mission, which he has enacted through the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Christ and the giving of the Spirit. And we particularly see that in Matthew 28 at the end of that chapter, and again in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. Now, there is never a moment in any of our lives when we retire from this ultimate calling. However, this ultimate calling is always worked out within a specific context. It's worked out in the midst of an ever-changing set of relationships and circumstances. So when a person retires, They need help to work out how can they use their gifts, their skills, their time, their experience, their connection, and their resources to grow, to love, to serve, and to glorify God. And so if we are going to equip retirees for discipleship in retirement, we need to understand the contexts that they are in, and we need to think about the challenges that they face. I'm going to say this slowly. As disciple makers, essentially, what we're looking to do is to help people discover who God is calling them to be and what he's calling them to do in the places where they spend their time during the week and in the challenges they face in this season. Now, I realize that's a long sentence, so I'm going to say it again, and hopefully it will make some sense. As disciple makers, essentially what we're looking to do is to help people discover who God is calling them to be and what he is calling them to do in the places where they spend their time during the week and in the challenges they face in this season. And so we need to ask questions like, how do people grow as disciples of Jesus in some of those circumstances, in all of those circumstances that you guys have just popped into the chat? And how might God be wanting to work through them for the good of others and for the glory of his name in their retirement years? So Ken, to help us to do that, I'm going to pass back to you, and I believe you have an exercise for us that will help us to begin answering some of those questions.
I do indeed. It's almost as though we've prepared this, Joe, isn't it? So we have a story of a chap called Martin, and we're going to put in the chat. So you need to go below all those wonderful comments that have come in and challenges that we faced, a link for you to read Martin's story. So this isn't a group chat. This is an individual chat. So that very long SharePoint link that says Martin's story is what you'll click on in just a moment, and we'll give you about 9 minutes to read and have a think about what stands out for you about Martin's story. In what ways did Martin grow through his time? And how do you see Martin's relationship with God making a difference in these circumstances? And if you have time, imagine Martin was in your church. What might you say to him? What would you say to him? What stands out to you? In what ways did you see him grow in this time? How do you see Martin's relationship with God making a difference in these circumstances? Imagine Martin was in your church.
So what we're going to move into now is a time where we're going to be thinking about what it means to grow in retirement, and also what it means to serve in retirement. So we're going to be looking at growth and service, starting particularly with growth. And when you get a chance to look at the Martin story, he is one of the people who has changed my life the most, and I had 2 conversations with him. So would really, really recommend that you do have a look at his story, because I think it's such a fantastic example of how God can grow us in our retirement years, even when things are unexpected and are not what we had wanted. So his story is a great story, and I definitely recommend you have a look at that in your own time. But one of the things that you'll notice about Martin is that though he grew, growth in the face of adversity is not inevitable, and it's not automatic. It happens when we face the challenges of life with the right mindset and with the grace of God. I'm sure there are many, many others in similar situations to Martin's who would have become angry and bitter and jealous and disillusioned. And I don't say that with any sense of judgment. What the situation Martin found himself in was a really challenging one. But he grew in that time. Not everybody would grow in that time. And so as people on this call, particularly those of you who have any form of pastoral oversight in whatever capacity that might be, it's really important for you to recognize the challenges retirees face, and that these challenges are catalysts, or can be catalysts, for growth. Often it is through challenges that God reveals to people the insufficiency of the idols that they may have been clinging to, but ultimately the sufficiency of his character and his gospel. For many, retirement is a time when cultural idolatry can be exposed for what it is, and where some of the sandcastles that people have been building can come crashing down. Some examples of the sandcastles we might build our lives on are things like, I'm valuable because I have physical beauty, or I'm valuable because I'm healthy and have abilities, or I'm valuable because I have power, or because I have status, or because I'm busy. That's one of our cultural idols, isn't it? We love to tell people how busy we are because it shows how valid we are. And as we age, to varying degrees, we lose some of these things. And that can leave us with some really significant questions around our identity and around our purpose. Now, this process can be really painful, but it is also part of God's gracious work in us, helping us not to build our lives on idols and on false beliefs. But it's an opportunity for us to build our lives more and more on God and upon his word. Now, what I'm not saying is somebody comes up to you and says, my husband has had a stroke, or I'm really lonely, that your first response should be, brilliant, this is a great opportunity for you to grow. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that as pastors, as leaders, as those involved in discipling older people, it's really important that you have a hope-filled perspective for people in all circumstances, and to patiently work through these issues with people with the aim that they will grow as disciples. Now, that's quite theoretical, so I want to ground this in a couple of very real-life examples. And I know that at least one of these appeared in the chat earlier when we were listing some of the places where people find themselves in retirement and some of the challenges that they might face in retirement. I'm not sure if the second one was. I think it possibly was. But I know this first one definitely was. So the first example of a challenge that people might face that they can go through is when people are being squeezed, when they are facing the demands perhaps of adult children and grandchildren on one side, but then also the challenges of having elderly parents themselves who might not be in the best condition, who are needing lots of support, lots of help. There might be challenges and questions around their parents needing to go into some kind of supported living or a care home or something like that. And so often people, especially in the early stages of retirement, they're finding themselves squeezed in the middle, as I say, between their children and grandchildren on one side who might have lots of demands on them, and then also they might have their own parents who are very old and really struggling. And so, of course, if you're in that situation, some of the likely feelings that you might experience are feeling overwhelmed, feeling exhausted, feeling taken for granted. Maybe even right now, actually, my parents-in-law are feeling taken for granted because they're about to go and pick up my kids from school and look after them for me. But although they might be having these negative feelings, even when a person is feeling squeezed, or a couple of feeling squeezed by kind of the generations on both sides of them, there are still so many possibilities for growth. So, for example, developing compassion while they're looking after their grandkids, while they're looking after their parents, it's an opportunity to develop compassion. It's an opportunity to learn to communicate clear boundaries. Those of you, if you have parents who you're looking after or helping to look after, or if you're looking after grandkids, or you've got adult kids who are constantly asking you for more money, that is an opportunity for you to learn to communicate clear boundaries with people around you. It's a time as well where if people are feeling particularly challenged and are feeling squeezed, it's a time to learn to depend more and more on God. It's a time where people can develop more of a servant heart. It can be a time to develop resilience and to develop patience with others. So when we're having conversations with people and they're saying that they're feeling this squeeze, yes, it's good to acknowledge how they might be feeling, but at the same time, it's helpful for us as those who are wanting to see them grow as disciples in the back of our minds to be aware of some of the possibilities that there might be for growth for these people, and to think about how we can play a role in helping to catalyze and to facilitate that growth. Then another example is a loss of mobility. Now, this isn't just something that happens to us as we get older. I myself, when I was 21, started to develop some fairly serious health issues, which have limited my mobility. So I know quite a bit about this one. And there'll be other people who, are at 85 and they're still, doing park run or whatever, and don't really have any mobility issues. But statistically, you are more likely to develop mobility issues as you get older than you are while you're younger. And again, some of the feelings this might lead to maybe sadness, frustration, anger, hopelessness, and just the unpleasantness of experiencing physical pain. But yet, even in this potentially very difficult time, there are so many ways that God might grow us. Perhaps it's a time where we might learn humility, learning to ask for help, where we deconstruct the idol of our culture that says that we should be completely self-dependent and self-sufficient. It's a time where we learn, actually, no, we're connected to others. And not only is it okay to rely on others, God actually calls us to rely on others. That's a good and that's a healthy thing. It might be a time for people to develop flexibility, just finding other ways to get around, finding new exercise regimes. Maybe perhaps, a person slips a disc and they can't play golf anymore. Well, maybe there's some other form of exercise they can take up, or some new activity that they can do instead. Or maybe there's a way they can play the game and modify their swing, or do some exercises that will allow them to keep playing. But whatever the solution might be, is going to require flexibility. It's a time to develop gratitude for the things that you can still do. It's so easy for us when we are impaired in some way just to focus on what we can't do. But maybe it's a time where God is calling us to grow in gratitude and to think about the things that we can do, the things that we are grateful for, and being grateful for the things that we've been able to do that perhaps we can't do anymore, but to at least say, thank you, God, that I got to enjoy that activity for so many years before now. It might also be a time where we can grow in our identity, where we learn that our worth is based in Christ and not on what we can do. And then relationships. Sometimes when we are suffering in some way with some kind of physical symptom, it might mean that we're not in places that we used to be, or we're not doing activities that we normally do, but maybe that leads to new activities or new relationships. Maybe it means that we find ourselves in places that we otherwise wouldn't have been. We once shared a story of a lady who developed an amazing ministry at a hydrotherapy class because she had arthritis, and that's somewhere that she went, and that became a really fruitful frontline for her. And as well, just the last thing that I want to say on growth before we go into serving, and don't have time to go into this in any real detail, but one of the areas that we are particularly researching into at the moment at LICC is the area of spiritual practices. And so, yes, growth can come through difficult times and us responding well to them, but it's also about the rhythms that we build into our lives and how we can feed ourselves and develop ourselves so that we can grow more Christ-like. But I don't want to say too much about spiritual practices now, or that might mean that you don't come to a webinar that we do in the future on the importance of spiritual practices. So that's a little bit on growth. And I now just want to speak for a few minutes about serving. What does it mean to serve in retirement? We've talked so far about lifelong vocation, and that all of us at every stage in our lives have this vocation to follow Jesus, to become like him, to join him in his mission, and all of those things. And then obviously, we just thought about some of the ways that we might grow, that older people might grow as they face some of the challenges of retirement and as they're in different places in retirement. But now I want us just to think for a moment about the opportunities retirees have to bless and to serve others and to make a difference in the places where they spend their time. We're going to, in a few minutes, I'll be passing on to Ken, and we're going to think about a story, and there's going to be a link that is going to work where you'll be able to see that. But before we get into some of those specifics, I want us just to take a moment to think about the place God wants retirees to be serving from. In retirement years, many people, whether this is consciously or semi-consciously or subconsciously, wrestle with big issues of identity. So asking that question, who am I? Wrestling with the issue of purpose, what should I do? And asking questions about relationships, now that I'm not where I used to be, who am I connecting with? Now, of course, the gospel at a fundamental level answers all of these questions. So who am I? The identity question. Well, I'm a child of God. I'm a member of his family. What should I do? Well, I should do the will of God. I need to listen to his voice and fulfill his vocation that he has for me in this season. And then the relationship question, who am I connecting with? Well, if you're a believer, you're connecting with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. You're connecting with other believers and with other people around you who are made in the image of God. It's really important that we help retirees grapple with these questions and to discover God's truth for them, because these are the truths that provide a secure base for fruitful living. And when we understand them properly, they draw us upward to God and they draw us outward to the people and the world around us. So in other words, knowing these truths puts retirees in a good place to be ready to serve. And serving is good. When people see retirement primarily as being all about them, or just thinking about it as a time of leisure, going back to that, what we were thinking earlier, where if people just see it as a time of vacation, then that's actually going to be really bad for them. If they're looking at retirement as just a time of 100% vacation of holiday, then they are going to become less like Christ. And ultimately, they're going to be less satisfied. So, of course, retirement is definitely an opportunity for many people to enjoy the goodness of God's creation. And that's something we're encouraged to do in 1 Timothy 6:17. But sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins. And the Bible says that a life that revolves around the self, around the flesh, is evil. That's what we read in Romans 8:6. So retirement is not about carrying on exactly the same as people have always lived, but it is about finding ways to serve and to be useful, often in new ways. Now, sometimes that might mean using existing skills and passions. Sometimes it might be discovering and developing new ones. Some of these opportunities to serve people press upon the retiree. So sometimes a situation arises beyond their choosing. There's just something that happens, something that presses upon them, and then they have to choose how they respond. And then at other times, there are times where we might have a bit of a blank slate and we have some choices to make around where we're going to spend our time in retirement and how we might serve others. And to help us to think a bit more about this, Ken is going to share a story about his mum. And then he's also going to share with us another story that we'll be able to read and to reflect on, that help us to just think about this thing of the things that press upon us and how we might respond to them. And then also some of the things that we might choose. So Ken, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks again, Joe. Really helpful. I think when I think of my own mum, I think it's a reminder to me of these different stages, some of which are expected and planned and some of which are not planned, and how retirement isn't one thing, it's a variety of different things. So right now, my mum is 93. She is in a home positive. She's in a home where COVID has broken out. Her symptoms are mild, as it is for pretty much everybody in the home this time round. Your prayers are appreciated. I'm blessed that she is, when I think of heroes of the faith in my own life, she's definitely right up there. But if I think of her years since paid work came to an end and she moved into retirement, she was a teacher. It's been a whole variety of different things. So she volunteered in schools for a while, helping children to learn English. Then she helped adults learn English. Then we moved into ministry in Chichester and we had children. The pull of grandchildren was sufficiently great that she came and supported us in doing that, after first checking with my wife whether she would actually view it as supportive. And she did, and was hugely helpful there. In my church, when we began to talk about whole life discipleship and having a front line, a place where we spend most time with people who don't yet share our faith, she realized as a retired person that perhaps she was spending almost all of her time with other Christians and in church context. She was fluent in French, but she joined a French conversation class in order to have her own front line, a place where she was making more contact. And so often she would talk about Jesus when opportunity arose there. I remember on one occasion in the French conversation class, they were asked, if you could talk to one person alive or dead, who would it be? And everybody in the class, this is obviously taking place in French, I won't do that for you because my French isn't good enough, but they were all saying to each other, we know what she's going to pick. She's going to say Jesus. And my mum said, the Apostle Paul. And they all said, we thought you would pick Jesus. And she said, well, I do speak to Jesus. I speak to Jesus every day, but I've never met Paul. So I would like to speak to him. Great answer, I thought. And then her mobility and her mental capacity got a little bit more strained and she wasn't quite able to do that. She went to the dentist. Her dentist was Spanish, and she offered to teach her dentist English, a better version of English, in a way perhaps only an older person could do to a younger person. That relationship has developed over the years such that that dentist would view my mum as kind of her mum in Europe, and joined an Alpha course with my in Britain, and joined an Alpha course as a result. As things moved on, my mum wanted to move into a home. Dementia was becoming a thing for her, and she is happy in the home. I would say, if I'm honest, even though I've talked about whole life discipleship and frontline and all of those things for 24 years in a church that she's been part of, she might not remember words like frontline now, but she is still living it out. She's still a whole life disciple. That's in her DNA, it's in her genes, even if she's lost some of the words and the terms for it. So if you talk to the carers in that home, they love having her around because of what it is in her character. If you talk to the other residents, the same. So whole life discipleship hasn't been one thing, nor has her mental or physical capacity, but in a range of different ways, she still showed herself to be a whole life disciple. And there'll come a day when her life on this earth will come to an end, and she's ready for that. And she's talked about it openly, to pick up one of the questions in the chat, both in terms of practical arrangements when she had the mental capacity to do that, and in terms of emotionally and just ordinary planning of a service type arrangements that she would want. So retirement's been many things just to that one person. And now, with great faith, I'm going to tell you that we have another person to discuss, and that person is James, and a link will be in the chat to James's story. And this is again a chance for you to consider on your own what this story, read the story on your own from the link. Again, I'll pause long enough for some of you to tell me the link is working, and then answer these three questions. What strikes you? Please work, says Joe. What strikes you about James? How is this voluntary role good for him? How is it good for others? Can you think of an example of someone in your congregation who's made choices to serve others in retirement? To what extent have they used existing skills and gifts? And to what extent have they discovered and developed new ones?
Interesting as well, just thinking about what you've just been saying there, Ken, and there's a comment here about what about people who have fallen out of love with the church, but they love Jesus still. And maybe one of the reasons why people fall out of love with church, I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons, but I think one of the big reasons is, for a lot of people, their time that they spend within their church communities just feels so disconnected from what they're doing in their everyday lives. They feel like, you know, they are living all of this life outside of church activity, but that often isn't acknowledged. It isn't often the teaching doesn't always connect to the stuff that people are doing during the week, and people aren't, you know, people get affirmed for the volunteering they do in the church, but don't get affirmed for the ways that God is working through them out in the world. And so another reason why LICC exists, and we're so grateful for you all being here today. And it's one of the reasons why me and my wife started giving to LICC before I started working for them. It's just a great cause, and perhaps it definitely is something that the UK church needs to take seriously, is how do we equip people for the places where they are. And if we're not doing that, more people will fall out of love with church, even if they don't fall out of love with Jesus. But no, so thank you, Ken. It's at this point, in a moment, Ken and I want to share some really practical things that you might want to do within your church communities and the groups that you're ministering amongst. But maybe at this point, one of the questions you might be asking is, what about people who have really limited capacity physically and maybe mentally as well? And, you know, Ken touched on some of those things when he was sharing with us the example of his own mum. But some people in retirement do find themselves facing very limited capacity or being very restricted in their circumstances, whether that's because of health or, you know, care needs, all kinds of things press upon people. So what about those types of people? One of the things that really encourages me in my own discipleship and encourages me as I think about people in positions where they might be facing that limited capacity is that the most important thing is the heart. And so a person with limited capacity and a heart that desires to bless others is going to make more of a difference for the kingdom of God than the life of somebody who has high capacity but has no desire to bless others. So I'll say that again: a person with limited capacity and a heart that desires to bless others will make more of a positive difference in the lives of others than someone who has high capacity but has no desire to bless others. And so just three really quick vignettes of when I was researching and having conversations with lots of retirees and with leaders, as I referred to earlier. One lady I came across is a lady, I won't say her name just in case, but she is someone who found herself in a position where she was quite limited, and was spending a lot of her time at home. And she found that God gave her a ministry of cake baking. And so whether there was somebody in the church or a neighbor or someone in her family, just, you know, someone who needed some encouragement or some comfort or just some random blessing, this lady would make really, really nice cakes and just give it to people. And that was a way that she found that she could serve God and bless people, even in her with a limited capacity that she had. There was another lady who found herself basically housebound, and for her it became a ministry of letter writing. And so she just started writing letter after letter to people that she used to know, people who were in prison, family members. And she found that a lot of people didn't respond to her letters, but there were some people who did, and it was an absolute lifeline for them and a real blessing for them. And she developed some really deep relationships and really blessed and helped a lot of people through the letters that she was writing. And then another example of a lady who was attending a weekly group, and this particular lady was suffering or living with really quite severe dementia. And she would go to this group that would meet once a week, and she would literally just squeeze people's hands and just say, "I love you and God bless you." And that was all she was able to do. But when I say that was all she was able to do, it was something that blessed so many people in that group. And the leader of this particular group who shared this story with me about this lady said that there was one day where this lady was just sitting at the edge of the group and just crying, just saying how frustrated she was that she didn't have her mind working properly and that she didn't feel that she could make a difference anymore. And this leader was able to say to her, you bring so much blessing to this group just by being here and bringing your love and just telling people that you love them and just speaking simple blessings over people. And so for me, what's really helpful in that in the ministry that God has given me as a disciple maker, is that I need to remember that the ultimate thing, it's about forming hearts. That as disciple makers, the most important thing we can do is to help people to develop hearts that are Christ-like, that are loving and that are serving. And so even for ourselves, if we find ourselves in a season of lower capacity, if our hearts are there to bless, we can still make an amazing difference in the lives of people and point them to Jesus just by having that heart that wants to bless others. What I want us to do now is to share some really practical steps for some things that we can do, that we can do to help equip and encourage the retirees who are around us. So Ken and I are going to play a little bit of practical steps tennis. So I'm going to share a practical thought with you, and then just as you start to recover from that one, Ken will attack you from the other side with another. So if you are taking notes, you might want to jot some of these down, but as has been made clear, well, I think that there is already a link to the PowerPoint, and that will also be sent out again when you get a follow-up email. So you will be able to get the slides with all of these, well, at least in bullet point form, these ideas. So practical idea number one that you might want to think about is casting a vision. Now, one of the ways that you can cast a vision for what fruitfulness in retirement could look like is to think about the 6 M's. Now, for some of you, you're thinking, what on earth are the 6 M's? For others of you who have journeyed with LICC or have picked up some of our resources, might be familiar with the 6 M's. But just in case you're not, I'm just going to run through them now. And to think about, how do each of these M's, what might they look like in the life of a retired person? So the first M is modeling godly character. That is essentially, how do we display the fruit of the Spirit in the places where God has put us, in those everyday places where we might be? Well, we've seen one example of that, or we should have seen one example of that if the link had worked properly. We're in the story of Martin, and in the way that he cared for his wife, that he was patient, that he was kind, that he was loving both to his wife and also to people who would sometimes ask not particularly helpful questions or make not particularly helpful suggestions to him. He found that he was able to model godly character in that setting. The second M is making good work. And we saw an example of that in Tom's story, in James's story, where he was able to use his tech skills to help others. And we saw it in the life of that lady who makes cakes, that she makes really good cakes. She doesn't just make rubbish cakes and try and bless people with them. People are genuinely blessed by the cakes that she makes because she makes really, really good, tasty cakes. The third M is ministering grace and love. Again, this is something that we saw in Martin's life, that with his wife Myra, he ministered grace and love to her and to those around him. We saw it with James, that he ministered love to somebody who came in needing help with their tech, but then also as that person became unwell, that James was able to walk that road with that person. And we saw it in those short stories that I just shared a moment ago of the 3 ladies, showing love to people through cakes and letters and just words of comfort and a squeeze of the hand. The next M is molding culture. Molding culture is something that might sound like something that's quite difficult to do, but sometimes it's just as simple as something that Simon and Nicola did, the couple that we thought about very briefly near the beginning of our time together. And they mold the culture, they seek to mold the culture of their tennis club If people are starting to be gossipy, or if there's sort of a cynicism in the way that people are talking, they seek to create a culture that is positive and inclusive and warm. And they also live out the fifth M, which is being a mouthpiece for truth and justice. That if somebody is gossiping about somebody else and just saying something that's just not kind or not true, they think really carefully and how they can be wise in responding to those comments to make sure that actually that person who's not there isn't talked about in that way, that maybe the conversation goes off in a different direction, or maybe that they help to highlight something that is good about that person, or that puts this criticism in context, that ameliorates it. And then finally, the sixth M is all of us are called to be messengers of the gospel. And all the other five M's help us to do this well, because when we are living a Christ-like life, and when we're doing things well, and when we're showing people love, and when we're making places better, when we're speaking up for what is true and what is good, people are much more likely to be interested in hearing something about the gospel that we have to share. And the gospel that we have to share makes a lot more sense, because not only do people get to hear the gospel as we explain it, but they've seen it lived through how we've been amongst them, perhaps just in one encounter, maybe as they've known us for many, many years in those places. But that's something that you can do, is in casting a vision for what this can look like, is to share the 6 M's with people and to help them to see what it looks like for them to live them out in retirement. Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And just picking up on that last one, it was that being a messenger of the gospel, because of everything else they'd seen, that was the story for my mum and the Spanish dentist. She, just one day doing these English classes, going to visit her, she said, I don't really want to do the English books today. I want to talk to you about God and about the Bible that you've got over there, though my mum had never opened the Bible with her, just because she saw something in her. So it's all of those M's, not just the last one, but we pray we get an opportunity for all of them. When we think of trying to make a whole organization, a whole community, a whole church move in the direction of breaking away from the sacred secular divide and going towards whole life discipleship, we often say what you need to do is not think, how do I transform the church tomorrow, but how do I make some 1 degree shifts, some pivotal shifts that might help make this move? And we can take that thought and say, so what do 1 degree shifts look like, particularly thinking of those of retirement age? So generally we would say a good 1 degree shift might be to visit somebody on their front line and in their workplace, or the general frontline place, wherever that is, where they're spending most time. Not because they've got a pastoral crisis, not because anything is going brilliantly well, just because. The question then becomes, do we include somebody of retirement age in the portfolio of people that we visit in that category? We've often said, and if you haven't come across this idea before, do try it, that a this time tomorrow slot in a church service is a great way, a really effective way of having a 1 degree shift. A 2-3 minute slot in a church service where you invite one person up and ask them where they will be this time tomorrow, and then you gain some insight into their wider world, their outside of church world, and pray for them. So the question becomes, do we include people of retirement age in the this time tomorrow slots, or just those who've got interesting paid work? It's good to have a variety. We would often, for example, ask people, where are you experiencing pressure, presence, and where can we pray for you? Where are you experiencing pressure on your front line? Where are you experiencing the presence of God and a sense of purpose? We would say pressure, presence, purpose, and then it results in prayer. So you could ask a retirement person, where do they see pressure in their life? Where do they see the presence, the purpose of God in what they're doing? Where do they notice his presence? And then pray for them. Those 3 Ps, if they work for you. Any of those could be 1 degree shifts. Joe.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Yeah, the next one. So one of the things that I did back when I was in my last role working as a discipleship pastor is we put on a monthly evening service. So our church, the morning service was the main service, but then the evenings there was a bit more scope to do some different things. And so once a month, we put on something that we called a sectors service. Now, what we did in these sectors services is we took people from different sectors of life. So we did one for people working in education. We did another one for people working in finance, another one for people working in healthcare. Did another one focusing on people who are parents or foster parents or grandparents. Another one on what it means to live with long-term illness or disability. But one of the topics that we picked was retirement. And so what we do in these sector services is once you've got your topic, is you pick 2 or 3 people from within the congregation who you think would be good on a panel talking about that season of life and what it means to be a disciple of Jesus there. So for the retirement one, I picked 3 retirees, who, a couple of, I think it was 2 ladies and a man, and people at different stages of retirement. So someone who's fairly recently retired, someone who had been retired for about 10 years, and then someone who had been in retirement even longer than that. And then what I had done is I gave them some questions beforehand to be thinking about. And I said, I think it was 6 or 7 questions. And I said, here are the questions that I want you to think about. And on the night, you're going to have between 60 to 90 seconds to answer. So just think of a fairly succinct way to answer this question. So that was the kind of the preparation that it took, was just finding the right people to be on the panel, giving them the questions to think about. Then at the beginning of the evening, I just did a short talk, just a 10-minute kind of a basic theology of retirement, of age, of what it means to live with God in that season of life. And then I interviewed the panel. And so I asked them, these are questions that they had in advance. And then on the night, I was asking them questions like, what did life look like before you retired? Now that you're retired, what are the main things that you do? I asked, to what extent has retirement matched your expectations? What's the best thing and the worst thing about being retired? Can you describe one way God has helped you to grow in this season? How do you see God working through you at the moment? And what would be one piece of advice that you would give to others as they enter retirement? And one of the great things about doing that is it means that it's a way that people can share the wisdom and the testimonies that they have in their own lives, so people can learn from their peers. It's a way of affirming that season of life, because, wow, we're having a whole service just on this one topic. But it was also really helpful for those of us who weren't in retirement, because it gave us an insight into what our lives are like for our brothers and sisters who are in a different season to us. So it's really enriching for everybody who was at that particular service. And then what we did is once the panel had been interviewed, I'd ask them those questions. We then had a little bit of time for Q&A, because people are interested and that, there's things they wanted to ask that I hadn't asked. And then we finished just by having a time to pray for people, not only the ones who were on the panel, but to pray for everybody in the church who is represented by that sector. So at the retirement one, as well as praying for those 3 who were on the panel, we prayed for all of our retirees. And it was just a really powerful way to learn from them and from their experiences, but also to say, as a church, we really value you and we value this season that you're in, and we want to commission you for it. So maybe you might want to do something like that. You might want to take that idea and use it in a slightly different way. That's just how I did it, what I thought would work in our setting. But maybe there's a way that it would work differently for you. But maybe something like a sector service might be something for you to consider. Ken.
Thanks, Joe. This might seem obvious, but I don't find it obvious as a preacher, as somebody who leads Bible studies in a variety of different settings. When I'm preaching on the Bible, when I'm taking a passage and then I go to make a connection or an illustration, the natural thing for me to do is to think about my world and my context and my age group and the things that interest me by way of connection. So the obvious thing to do is to make a mental note to include a variety in that context. And for today's context, to think about how does this Bible text apply to somebody of retirement age? What are the challenges, opportunities, and what are the frontline contexts where this might be applicable in that age group? And how might, thinking from that perspective, shed particular light on the biblical passage. It's so enriching when we do the hard yards and do that and make that connection. So, for example, we might have been preaching on 1 Peter, and we might also offer the thought that we might all have lost a lot as those who have been written to have paid a great price. But we can go one stage further and say, as our life on earth comes to an end, and we might not be afraid to say that, picking up some of the other conversations that have been in the chat, you can be sure that you have put your faith in the right place and offer some reassurance there. Suffering that we experience now is not purposeless, but refines us, and bring that from a retirement perspective. We might picture Jesus going on his own outside and including outsiders in Luke 5:27 to 32, for example, and say, who are the outsiders for you in your context? Now, again, I might think of my world, but I could picture a grandparent like Joe's in-laws picking up the grandchildren and say, so who are the outsiders around the school gate? You might feel like you're the outsider, but who can you reach out to who might also be an outsider? Who can you see there in that context? I might pick a psalm and pick the most famous, Psalm 23, and say, okay, let's reflect back on this psalm to celebrate. How has God provided for you and protected you and comforted you and brought you joy over the full length of your lifespan? I might deal with some of the difficult questions of life and say, look, we don't have all of the answers, but some here in this room have lived long enough to have seen some more answers, and have certainly seen enough to go on to keep going. Talk to them and celebrate the variety and the experience that there is in the room. Just a few examples there, Joe.
Great. Yeah, and another idea is just this quite simple one of having transitional conversations. Now, this isn't something that just has to apply to people as they move into retirement. This could be, you know, the kind of conversations we might have with people before they go off to start an apprenticeship or to start work or to start uni, or as they move into a time of long-term sickness, or as they prepare to get married, or, you know, when they have kids or whatever it might be. There's something really powerful in life about transitioning from one season or one context into the next. It's often a time when people are more open to thinking about, well, what will it mean for me to live well in this stage that I'm going into? Often people are up for having those kinds of conversations when they are transitioning. So what would it mean for you to have a good transitional conversation with somebody as they approach retirement? Perhaps, you know, in those weeks just before they retire, or maybe once they've had, you know, a few months into their retirement, just to have that conversation with them as their church leader or as their small group leader, or maybe even just as their friend, just to say, well, you know, what is happening now? What are some of the things that you think you might do? How do you think God might be wanting to work through you? And particularly if you are a church leader, to approach that conversation with a wider lens than perhaps you might otherwise have had. So yes, you might want to talk to that particular individual and say, you know, you've been working as an accountant for the last 40 years, and we've got a, you know, we've been looking for a treasurer for the last 2 years. Maybe you would like to consider that. But as well as thinking about how that person might get involved within the life of the church, just for you as a leader to think a bit more broadly and to think about, well, how might hobbies feature in that conversation? How might family life? How might volunteering outside of church? Maybe there might be bits of work that they're still picking up on a part-time or on a freelance basis. So just helping them to think through some of the stuff that we've talked about today, around purpose, around relationships, around service, around growth. Just can often be a really good time to have a conversation like that, is as somebody transitions from one season into the next. Ken?
I wonder where the contexts are in your church where people can feel free, and the culture is to feel free to talk openly and honestly about what's really going on in their whole life context, in their frontline places. And of course, a frontline place, as we've said already, might be their home. It might be the carers coming in to their home. But where are those conversation places? Is it a walking group? Is it a breakout group in in a Zoom? Is it a little discussion in a service where you say, let's just stop and talk about what this looks like for you? How can we engender a conversation that helps people to talk about the places of pressure, presence and purpose, for example? And maybe we model that as small group leaders, as church leaders, as ministers, pastors. People might not expect us to ask these questions. They might expect us to ask them about the rota and about their contribution in church life, which of course we have to do. But to say to them, while I've got you, could you tell me one thing to be praying for you in your front line this week, and intentionally to be including those of retirement age in that context? Joe.
Great. And then the final suggestion is to point people towards good resources. So as I alluded to earlier, when I was researching this whole area of what does it mean to be fruitful in retirement, I was mostly disappointed with what I found. I just found there are a lot of books that were just quite poor, if I'm honest, as in they weren't, I don't know, maybe that they were okay, but they would only approach the topic of retirement from a particular angle. So I found quite a lot of stuff on kind of approaching retirement in a very practical way, which is really good, and we need that. There was also quite a lot around approaching retirement from a spirituality perspective, but not a whole lot that I would say was really focused on whole life discipleship. So how do people actually live as disciples in retirement? There was stuff around how can you be a good evangelist in retirement, which again is really good, but is perhaps a more narrow way of thinking about being a disciple than what I think the Bible holds out to us. So in amongst all the stuff that wasn't great, there was some stuff that is really good. One of the courses that a couple of my colleagues have said is really good. There's a lady called Helen Calder who runs a course called Retiring Well. And after this webinar, you might want to look this up. So her course is particularly aimed at people as they are approaching their retirement. And it looks at things from quite a wide perspective. So as well as there asking some discipleship questions, there's also stuff around some of the really practical planning. But you can Google her course, Retiring Well, but don't do that just yet. But that's something you might want to look at. Of all the books that I read, the very, very, very best book by a very long distance was one called An Uncommon Guide to Retirement, which is written by a guy called Jeff Harnan, who's based out in Denver in the States. Interestingly, he's also a fairly young guy. I think he's in his 40s, but he's done some brilliant thinking around retirement, and I found his book particularly helpful. And if that's one that you do end up picking up, you might find that he's copied some of the things that I have said today. He just happened to write them down before I said them. But his book was really, really helpful. So if you want to go a bit deeper and to read a book, I would say head and shoulders above all the others. I haven't read every single book on retirement, so there might be others that are better than this one. But of the ones that I read, An Uncommon Guide to Retirement was really good. And then finally, well, almost finally, penultimately, there's some guys who run a network called After Work Net. Again, you might just want to check out their website. It's got some nice articles on there and some ideas for being a disciple in retirement. That's up on the screen at the moment, After Work Net. Again, if you Google that, you might get some useful ideas from them. But I know that the moment that you have all been waiting for is for me to share with you about the new resource. And essentially everything that has come before now has just been like really long adverts. It's been like a long trailer before you finally get to the movie. So yeah, I want to talk to you today about a new resource that we have just released called Repurpose. Now, Repurpose, I'll start off just by telling you who it's for. Primarily, it's been written for those who have recently retired. However, it would be just as relevant to somebody who has already been retired for 20 years. So it's one of those ones where it's always better to think about how you want to do something just as you start doing it, rather than after you've been doing it for 20 years. but it's still better. It's like that old proverb, isn't it? The best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago, and the next best time is today. So it's written for anyone who's in retirement, and we're particularly hoping that people will look at this in the very early stages of their retirement. It's a 6-part study guide for small groups. Each session is a blend of giving people an opportunity to reflect on their own experiences, at looking at a passage of scripture, of hearing a real life story, of an older person or some older people and how they discovered fruitful living in their setting. And then there's also opportunities for people to pray together, and there's some creative activities for people to do in between sessions to take the learning deeper and to ground it into their lives. So in terms of the content of the 6 sessions, I'll just quickly outline what those 6 sessions are and what they cover. The first one is Rear View, which is really giving people an opportunity to reflect on the life that they have lived up until now, and to think about, well, before now, God has been at work in your life. So how have you already been fruitful? What do you want to celebrate from what God has already done in you and through you and around you? And what are some of the ways that God has been faithful to you that you want to thank him for and hold on to as you go into this season of retirement? Then the second session is all about identity, asking that question, now that I'm not a solicitor or a machine operator or a nurse or whatever I was before, who am I? And just exploring that deep question of identity. The third session looks at context. So now that I'm not in the office or the classroom, or now that I'm not out on the road or in the workshop, where am I? Where are the places where I might be connecting with people who don't yet share my faith? And what might God be calling me to do there? The fourth session looks at vocation. We've thought about that quite a bit today. And that session is all about giving people the opportunity to think about God's call upon them, to think about that really big call, and then to think about, well, how do you work that out in the season of retirement? The fifth session focuses on growth. It's all about dispelling the myth that retirement is a time of plateau or decline. And that's a session where people can recognize, now actually, because God is in our lives, every season can be and should be a season of growth, even if that growth looks different to the previous season. And then finally, legacy, especially this thinking about what Ken shared with us today. How can retirees sow to the future? What can they do to bless and encourage and catalyze the younger generations? What can they leave behind? So that's what the resource covers. If it's not already in the chat, there will be a link going up in just a few seconds.
Yes.
Great, thank you, Ken. And the best thing about this resource is it is completely 100% free. And so the guide is downloadable, so you can print it, or if people have got their tablet devices, they can follow along on that. As a general rule of thumb at LICC, we don't do separate guides for leaders and for participants, because we found in our research people have better discussions if everybody can see all the material that's available. So I do recommend, if you're using this with a group, or if you're encouraging other groups in your church to use this, try and make sure that everybody has a copy of the guide, so that they can see it, because there's just something about being able to see the question rather than hold it in your head that enables people to answer better. So this might be something that you might want to use with existing small groups, if you've got small groups that are made up exclusively of people in retirement. But maybe it might be something that you want to bring a temporary group together to use in your church, if you've got retirees who aren't in a small group, and you maybe want to run this as a kind of like a workshop thing that runs over a 6-week period, over a half term. Or it might even be something that you want to use ecumenically. So maybe as a way of doing something with churches around you, perhaps get some kind of cafe style thing going, where you get retirees from across your local area or network to come together and to use this resource. So the link is in there in the chat, and as I say, it's free, and I hope that you and others really benefit from it. So feel free to just share that with your friends, and yeah, and hopefully it will be really, really helpful for lots of people.
Thanks so much, Joe. Yep, so the link is there as one of the very last things in the chat, and also the summary of those 6 sessions. So review, identity, context, vocation, growth, legacy. Not many of us can remember 6 things like that. And of course, once you download it, you'll get them there, but they're there in the chat as well. So you can take a look at them. And we'd love to know how you're using it, how you might use it, and keep us informed as you go along with it. As Joe said, it's not only free to download, we're happy for you to print it and distribute it among participants, so that they can have it if a physical copy is the right way for them to get it. So we have almost closed. I would just like to make the most of this session by asking you, so what from your context? What a moment to pause and pray after I've asked these 2 questions, and then your own silent thoughts or reflections, and then I will close in prayer if I may. So perhaps it's good to just cement this with a particular personal action. What one-off action will you do as a result? And is there an ongoing thing? Is there an ongoing habit you might want to develop or feel prompted to develop? So just a couple of moments to think and pray that through, you personally, and then I'll close for all of us. Thanks, everybody. I've moved to the end of my script now. I've got no further notes on my desk, but as we were praying, my thought went to imagining the kingdom impact of this and praying into it. So the kingdom impact of our time together, of people of retirement age, older people being encouraged in their discipleship. In other words, being given courage, having someone come alongside is in the word encourage, and pointing them forward, and them then doing that for others in an iron sharpens iron way, such that those who are encouraged of retirement age encourage others in their generation and the generations below them, such that they then have a kingdom impact too. And Lord, we thank you for the resources that we've mentioned and the others that were mentioned in the chat. We pray blessing on them for this kingdom gain, and we pray blessing on this new repurpose resource that Joe and others have poured a good number of months and years into, and ask for it to be more than what is written in the text, that you would breathe life into it as people use it. And Lord, we pray that you would continue to bless the work of this institute in its role of trying to embed whole life discipleship across the generations in the UK and worldwide. And we pray that you would show us our part in joining in that story. Amen.